Hello everyone, Stepan here. Now that my own tournaments are over, now that some of the major tournaments have finished, for now at least, I have a couple of days to return to my Bobby Fischer series. And in today's video I'm going to go over a historically very important event and a very important tournament. And that was the Havana tournament of 1965, played in Cuba. And Bobby Fischer managed to participate in the end, but the story behind it is quite interesting. Firstly, that was the first international tournament Bobby played in 3 years since the Curacao candidate tournament of 1962, when he finally decided not to participate anymore because he was sure that the Soviets were conspiring against him in order to prevent him from becoming the world champion. And this is the first tournament in which he decided to reappear on the international chess scene. And of course, no one can say how much his strength deteriorated or increased in those couple of years. But the only thing we do know is that in 64 and in 63, he of course played the US Championship. He won it convincingly, and he also played about 150 simultaneous games and managed to practice that way at least. So regarding Havana 65, that was one of the best tournaments and the most paid tournaments in the 60s and in the 70s, because the Cuban government decided to give a lot of prize money. The winner would get $3,000 and another 5,000 would be given to the other top five finishers. And Fidel Castro wanted the thing to succeed. Che Guevara was one of the people behind it, so historically a very important event. And Bobby Fischer agreed to participate if he is given $3,000 participation fee, so regardless of his finish. And the Cubans decided to agree to that. And one of the other US players that participated was Larry Evans. And at the time of the Cold War, of course, you know that the USA and Cuba didn't have the best relations. So Larry Evans was allowed to play because he was also a journalist, and the US would often send journalists to non-friendly countries in order to be able to report about the events there. And Bobby Fischer agreed to write a review for some small magazine, I'm not sure for which, but he was still refused to go. And in the end, he played the tournament, which was held, of course, in Havana, Cuba. He played it from the Manhattan Chess Club via Telex, and his moves were given to his opponents by Capablanca's son, Jose Raul Capablanca Jr. And one thing I forgot to mention, this was the 4th Capablanca Memorial, so to honor Jose Raul Capablanca, of course, the best Cuban chess player of all time. So in these circumstances, Bobby Fischer managed to appear and to play. Now, in this game, he faced Vasily Smyslov, of course, the strongest player of the tournament, if you don't count Bobby Fischer, and the strongest Soviet player at the time, or one of the strongest, and his biggest contender for first place. In the end, Vasily Smyslov finished with 15.5 points. Bobby Fischer shared second place with 15 points. So he didn't manage to win. Perhaps that's because he wasn't there physically. Perhaps he would have done better had he been there. Another fun fact, Fidel Castro announced Fischer's appearance as great news and as a great political victory, and then Bobby Fischer finally got on the phone with him and told Fidel Castro that if he mentions his name in his political campaigns, once again he's going to withdraw. So that didn't happen anymore. So historically very important event, full of fun things to read on. And if you'd like, you can read a lot more about Havana 65. Now let's get to the game. So Bobby Fischer with the white pieces, Vasily Smyslov with the black pieces, and of course everybody knows that Bobby plays the king pawn to e4, and everybody knows that Smyslov plays e5. So both of them must have prepared. This was in round 2, so at the very start of the event. Now, of course, after knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, they get into the Spanish or the Roy Lopez, a6, bishop a4, knight to f6. And here Bobby Fischer deviates slightly. He doesn't go for castles, by far the most popular move. He goes for the Anderssen variation with d3, which is supposed to be equal for black already now on move 5, but white has a slightly different attacking plan, and it's by no means worse for white, or it's not a bad opening. d6, the main move, c3, bishop e7, knight b to d2. Bobby is going for the common Roy Lopez maneuver, knight f1, knight to g3, and threatening to enter or secure the f5 square. Castles, knight to f1, b5, bishop to b3, d5, queen to e2, and here the best move for Vasily Smyslov was to play a5 and get some initiative going on the queen side. After a5, knight to e3, d4, let's say this would be the best variation, knight to d5, d takes c3, castles, knight to d4. You can see that black has a lot of chances, and after knight takes, e takes, b takes c3, a4. White is slightly cramped on the queen side, and black has a lot more space, and black has a lot of initiative going, and black actually has an advantage. And the knight is misplaced on the d5 square, and white will now have to take on f6 or on e7. It's much better to take on f6. And then after bishop takes f6, play bishop to d5, attack the rook, and provoke the move c6. So it's very complicated for Bobby to get this position to relative equality. But after queen to e2, Smyslov didn't play a5, he played d takes e4, which is an inferior move, and this now allows Bobby to get a comfortable position in the center. So now d takes e4, bishop to e6, and he offers this exchange, but the f file isn't that useful for black at the moment, and it doesn't seem like it could become useful. So now after bishop takes e6, f takes e6, I think that practically speaking, white has an easier game. He has a weakness to exploit on the e5 square. There's also a weakness on the e6 square. The c7 pawn is backwards, so if white manages to hold it off with a move such as b4, and once white manages to develop something like this, then white will have a clear edge, and I don't see how white can fail to use black's weaknesses, because there's just too many of them. Secondly, black's knights don't have that many squares, and I think that this knight is condemned to the defense of the e5 pawn, and this knight, once h3 gets played, doesn't have that many prospects. Of course, for now, the threat is knight to h5, knight to f4, but that can, in some cases, be prevented. Here, Bobby continues with knight to g3. We have queen to d7, castles, rook a to d8, and now a4, stopping ideas of a5 and having a say on the queen side as well, and not letting Vasily have a free hand on the queen side. Now queen to d3 was played, offering a queen trade, and Bobby accepts. Queen takes d3, rook takes d3, now a takes b5, a takes b5, and rook to a6 was played. Now attacking both the knight on c6 and the pawn on e6. We have rook to d6 defending both, king to h1, and this move I stared at for about 20 minutes. And I couldn't figure out what the point of this is. Now, of course, white's back rank is sort of weak, you could argue. And perhaps Bobby Fischer was afraid of the move rook to d8. And then if the rooks come to the back rank, then he might have some problems. So perhaps knight to g1 was an option to defend. But if that's the point, why not just h3? I really couldn't figure out what this move was about. But still, it's Bobby Fischer, so it must have been about something. If you have any ideas, please do comment below. If you could tell me what king to h1, what the purpose of king to h1 was. Smyslov responds with knight to d7. We have bishop to e3, developing his last piece. Rook to d8, h3, h6, and the great thing about this game is that there was never really one move which was a final blunder by Vasily Smyslov. There wasn't one mistake which you could say lost him the game. But Bobby Fischer played so precisely, and even king to h1 is for some reason precise, but I can't say why. The engines like it. He played so precisely that his small incremental advantages managed to grow into something that Vasily Smyslov could no longer handle, and with each move his advantage seems to increase slightly. And Smyslov's moves were not bad, they were just worse than Bobby Fischer's, and you're going to see how this position, which is still okay for black, white has a slight edge, how this becomes completely lost. So now rook f to a1 was played, knight db8. This is a fairly strange and passive move. Rook to a8. Rook d1 check, trading a pair of rooks. Now king h2. Now, had the king been on g1, he could have also gone to h2. So king to h1 is now definitely proven to be a waste of tempo. But if king h1 wasn't played, I'm not sure what Bobby Fischer was afraid of. Once again, I'm completely lost as to why this move was good. Now rook takes a1, rook takes a1, knight to d7, a bit of repetition, b4. Now stopping any advances on the queen side, king f7, knight to f1, bishop d6, g3, and now the advantage seems to be increasing, and I'm not sure why Smyslov couldn't figure out what to do with his pieces a bit more actively, but it's fairly clear that the pressure on e5 is going to be increased on the e5 pawn. Now knight to f6, taking the e4 pawn, knight 1 to d2 defending, king e7, rook to a6, once again attacking the c6 knight, knight to b8, another passive move because this now allows knight rook to a5, c6 he has to defend, king to g2, another king move, but still the advantage seems to be increasing, knight b to d7, and now king to f1 was played, which was an inaccuracy. I believe that this move, the move knight to e1, should have been played, because after knight to e1 you can get a lot of pressure on the e5 pawn and get a position like this in which the pawn can hardly be defended. You can pin the knight with rook to a7, and I think this would have cracked open Smyslov's position, but he plays king to f1, and now we have rook to c8. Another mistake, he should have played rook to b8, and after rook b8, rook to a7, rook c8, I mean, at least you can hold the position. But rook to c8 immediately allows the move knight to e1 now, and he basically can't defend the pawn, I think, now, because Bobby Fischer has just gone for the plan I mentioned earlier. So now knight to e8, knight to d3, attacking e5, knight c7, c4. This was a very aggressive move, and if, of course, if he takes, which he did, bc4, now after knight to c4, you already have two attackers on e5, and you can reroute your bishop to attack the pawn once again. And of course, you are attacking with the rook. So here he already has to do something to defend the pawn. He plays knight to b5, blocking the rook to attack the e5 pawn. Rook to a6. King to f6, bishop c1, now rerouting the bishop to attack e5, especially now that the pawn is pinned. Now bishop to b8, bishop to b2, and here he should have played g5. g5 is the best move, because g5 would at least gain some initiative on the king side, even though the position is fairly hard to hold, and I'm not sure it's even possible to hold it. But here he played c5, which is just a blunder, and this now allows the move knight to b6. And this now forces a trade of the last defender of the e5 pawn. And now after knight b6, rook b6, you can see that the pawn is basically undefendable. Firstly, your knight is hanging. Secondly, okay, you will see what happened. Here Smyslov played c4, and this now allows knight to c5. And perhaps Smyslov was counting on the move c3. But now white has two threats. He's threatening to take on b5, and he's threatening to play knight to d7, forking king and bishop, or simply take the bishop, and after rook recaptures, knight to d7, taking the rook. So those are two threats which can't be defended at the same time. After c3, Smyslov actually resigned with his own move, and he gave up. And let me show you two variations. Firstly, bishop takes c3 doesn't work, because you don't have time to play knight to d7. If bishop takes c3, the position is actually equal, because knight c3, knight d7 check, king e7, knight takes b8, knight takes e4 would happen, and this is a draw. And you can't really win this position, even though you have a passed pawn on b4. You can't win. However, after c3, you can play bishop to c1, and this is now just busted, and you are inevitably winning a piece. You are either going to win the knight on b5 or the bishop on b8. So this is the variation I calculated. Knight to d4, this would be the best move. Knight d7 check, king e7, knight takes b8, knight to b3. And you can actually leave the bishop hanging for a moment. Bishop and rook to b7 check, king e8, rook takes g7, just hang the bishop, because black is going to have to give up one piece anyway. So here, if he takes the knight, then this is just losing because of rook g8 check. You're going to win the rook, and he doesn't have time to queen the pawn, because your king can enter the position. So this is now an exchange up and simply winning. And here, if after rook takes g7, he decides to take the knight here, then of course you can just win like this. I'm sorry. And you are winning everything. So taking the knight would be much better. But after c3, Smyslov gave up, and Fischer won against his biggest rival in the tournament. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough to win the whole event, and but still, a great tournament, a great performance by Fischer, especially after not playing major tournaments for 3 years. And this was a prelude to his road to winning the 72 World Championship match, which we are soon going to come to in about 15 games or 10 games. So stay tuned for the series on Bobby Fischer. And I'm also doing the theory of the Sicilian at the moment, and I'm going to be covering some more games from major tournaments. Dortmund is starting soon, and there are a lot of events to follow. Okay, everybody, thanks very much for watching. I hope you got something from this amazing game by Bobby Fischer, and stay tuned for more chess. Thanks very much. Bye.